Well, let's get started. Welcome back from lunch, everybody. This is a panel discussion about near Arctic markets meeting global demands, and there's been discussion so far about the richness of the Arctic, about the resources of the Arctic. It's about the supply side of the Arctic, and this conversation will delve into the demands, where the markets are going to be and how they're going to occur. And we have a mixture of theory and analytic framework and specific projects. I thought we would begin by having a theoretical overview. Dr. Rasmus Bertelsen from the Aalborg University in Denmark will launch us. Enjoy, and each presentation should be about 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll have questions at the conclusion.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction. And my name is Rasmus Bertelsen, as it says, and I would like to talk about some work I do with a colleague of mine, Professor Li Xing, at Aalborg University in Denmark. And there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of debate about the interest of Asian powers in the Arctic. And I want to supply some concepts for looking at that, for how we can think about that and how we can analyze that. First of all, I think it's important that we look at how to say the Arctic through the eyes of, for example, the Chinese. I'll focus on China in my presentation, but I think it's very important to also think about other major Asian powers, Japan, where I've lived, Korea, Singapore, etc. And I'd be very happy to discuss that in the discussion time. So if we see the Arctic through the eyes of the Chinese leadership, we have to keep in mind what are the core interests of the Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party. They have stated on many occasions, and there's a general consensus, that the core interests of the Chinese Communist Party are continued party rule, that is political stability, its territorial integrity, meaning that Taiwan does not declare independence, and its economic growth. And these three things hang intimately together because the continued rule by the Chinese Communist Party is premised on economic growth and territorial integrity. The Communist Party legitimizes itself today on economic performance and national cohesion. So what does that mean? Some of you may have listened to Eyet Nilsson's presentation over lunch yesterday, and I think Eyet will continue on this in his presentation. So how does this fit in with the Arctic? It basically fits in the way that as Eyet mentioned yesterday, China is very interested in climate change in the Arctic. And why is it very interested in climate change? It's because Arctic climate change affects weather patterns over China. Weather patterns influence agriculture, that influences food security, and that influences political stability. So that's why there is a link between the fate of the Communist Party of China and climate change in the Arctic. And then China has, of course, for the last 30-plus years, experienced an absolutely phenomenal growth. It's a growth that has probably never been seen before in world economic history. And that growth leads, of course, to much expanded energy need and need for raw materials. And therefore, China is on the lookout for energy resources and raw materials around the world. China is, I believe today, the second largest importer of fossil fuels in the world. And that raises some very interesting questions about energy security that I'll get to in a second. It needs raw materials. It's on the lookout for raw materials everywhere in the world. And the Chinese economy is driven, it's export-based, and that export travels on the seas. So, that raises some key strategic issues for China. As I said, China is increasingly dependent on imported oil. Over this century, the Chinese energy consumption will at least double, and China is a net importer of oil, and it will import more and more oil. And where does that oil come from? It comes from places like the Persian Gulf and from Africa. The Persian Gulf is militarily dominated by the United States, and of course we all know that the world oceans are dominated by the United States Navy. And then there's some talk about piracy, but piracy is a minor nuisance. I mean, the thing is that if you compare, for example, China and Japan, Japan is also completely dependent on Middle Eastern oil and Southeast Asian gas. But of course, Japan is a very close ally of the United States. China, for its energy supply and for its exports, are completely dependent on waters controlled by what can probably, in kind words, be described as China's strategic competitor, the United States. And that has a lot of influence on China's behavior around the world, including in the Arctic. That's what makes the Arctic also interesting. China has interests all over the world. It's interested in many, many regions around the world, and it also makes it interested in the Arctic. So after these introductory remarks, I'm a political scientist. I teach international relations. I always teach my students that it's very important to know your theories, because theories help you look at the world, they help you analyze the world. And in looking at the international relations of the Arctic, it's very important that we don't look at them in isolation from the rest of the international system, and that we use the tools, the theories, the concepts we have, because that will make us think in more clear ways about these questions. So I'll just use the last 5-10 minutes I have to mention some concepts we have in international relations and political science, because I think these concepts are useful for analyzing these questions. These are, how to say, perspectives on the world, where if you use these concepts, you illuminate different causalities, different actors, and you become more aware of these things. So what I listed here is some of the main theories used in academic international relations research. And these are theories that make assumptions about how the world works and which actors are important. And we can use these concepts to analyze and to think about these causalities. So the first very important concept is the concept of power transition. And we all remember the Cold War. After the Second World War, we lived through a period of bipolarity with two superpowers, and the relationship between those two superpowers very much defined the world. Then we had a time with what can probably call unipolarity, where the United States was and continues to be the only superpower. And of course, what very much marks the world these years is the rise of the rest. And the rise of the rest is overwhelmingly China. I mean, China is growing so fast and it has so much potential that is what will affect the international system. And we also see that in the Arctic. I mean, China sees itself as a legitimate stakeholder in regions around the world, including the Arctic. So we have to find a way of accommodating China in the Arctic. Then another very important current of thinking in international relations research is liberal theory. And that has nothing to do with political liberalism. Liberal theory is, whereas the first theory, realism, emphasizes the states and the states as actors, the second theory emphasizes other actors and actors within the countries, like companies and political parties. And there, of course, we also have to keep in mind which other actors are there. What are corporate interests? What are interests by political parties, etc., etc.? I mentioned the Chinese Communist Party before. Then we have heard many times during this conference about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. That is the most important institution. It's the most important set of rules concerning the Arctic. And there, of course, thinking about institutions, thinking about institutionalism is also very important. And it's very important, how will a new actor like China use these institutions, and how will these institutions constrain such a new actor? Then we have constructivism. And constructivism is the thinking that, our ideas about the world, our concepts, our institutions, they don't drop down from the sky. They are constructs of society. We more or less agree on that a state is what it is, that sovereignty is what it is, etc., etc. And therefore, that is the thinking that how we talk about things matter, how we define things matter. And there, of course, you probably all heard, the name of this session is Near Arctic Markets. And that's, of course, a play of words on near Arctic state, that China calls itself a near Arctic state. And China is trying to influence the way we talk about the Arctic in order to give itself legitimate rights in the Arctic. So how we talk about things, how we think about things is very important. And if one party can influence how we talk about things, it can gain influence. Transnationalism. Transnational relations we have the distinction between international relations and transnational relations. International relations are the relations between the states. Transnational relations are cross-border relations between actors within society. What we are doing at this conference here these days in Akureyri is very much transnational. People from academia, from business, from politics, from civil society are getting together, exchanging ideas, making collaborations, influencing each other, having new ideas, etc. And there, I believe that the Arctic is very much an instance of transnational relations, because the Arctic is very science-heavy, and of course science is transnational. Scientists, academics from different countries, they interact very much. And I'm sure that the AES will talk about that China's road into the Arctic is very much through science. It's very much through these transnational relations. And then a last thing that I very much encourage my students to work with, where China and the Arctic is a very interesting case, and that's foreign policy analysis, where you can look at if we take the case of China, how does China make decisions? How does it formulate its foreign policy? And of course, China is a closed society. It's not an open democratic society. And one way they do that is that they have a lot of talking heads, more or less public academics, public intellectuals, making a lot of statements. They see how does the world respond to that. And then there is a closed process later on where the decisions are made, the strategies are made. And we have seen concerning the Arctic that some years ago there were some very outspoken Chinese academics who were stating Chinese claims, Chinese rights in the Arctic. There was a pushback from the rest of the world, much toned down rhetoric from China, and how to say, the thinking, the analysis, the decision making is slowly moving forward like that. So these were some concepts for you to keep in mind when you think about not only China, but also other so-called near-Arctic states and their interests in China, in the Arctic. I think I'm out of time now, so I will end here. And thank you for your attention.